So today, we finished up on Friday talking about the single leg squat assessment. That is another posture assessment that is used to, oh, I almost clicked slides from the beginning. That is not what I want. I don't even want the thing in normal. I'm acting like I'm at real Sochi. So we talked about like the single leg squat, which really when you're observing it is designed to assess like your balance and stuff. But it has the same movement compensations present as a regular knees cave-in situation like we built on Friday. So when we were looking at like designing a program for a client, you know, who experiences like knees caving in on either the overhead squat or, I'm sorry, over this, either the single leg squat or the overhead squat, you know, if they have that knees buckling, that is showing like overactive adductors and overactive hip internal rotators. As well as like tibial external rotators. So those are definitely two of our most common postural distortions. Like you're going to see those postural distortions all the time. Like I'd say knees caving in is the most common out of all of them, probably followed by what we're looking at today, which is anterior pelvic tilt. Actually, you know what? Probably shoulder ramming is the most common, but definitely something you're going to see all the time. So we were looking at like, if we're having trouble with like knees caving in, right, we are going to work on externally rotating the femur and then also like abducting instead of adducting, right? So we're going to see somebody who's, you know, feet tend to flatten instead of like staying in a neutral position. And then we also did mention briefly on Friday, knees caving out, which is a postural distortion you're not really going to see until you get to capstone. But that's excessive inversion of the foot and that bow-legged posture. And then we also looked at really briefly at our LESS test, right? That jumping assessment, the landing error scoring system. Now that assessment actually uses a depth jump, which for those of you who don't know what a depth jump is, it's basically just like, you know, when you look at the three sort of most popular jumping exercises, you've got like regular old squat jumps, right? And that's just where you squat and jump straight up in the air, nothing fancy, done and done. And then you've got like a box jump, which is where you are on the floor and you jump onto a box. Also very, very, very popular. But then the third one, which is actually my favorite, is a depth jump, which is actually where you start on top of the box, jump down, but rather than just jumping down and landing, you jump down and then immediately leap back up. So what ends up happening is you get all this like force from like your momentum as it's driving into the ground to force you into a rapid stretch, and then you can do a really rapid shortening afterwards. So you get that stretch shortening cycle kind of built in for you. And it can just train you how to be a little more reactive and a little more explosive. I also really like if I've got a client in the stabilization level, I box jump down to stabilization, which is just jumping down with no springing back up afterwards. Both those are really good. And I think they're kind of overlooked a lot of times. Like a lot of people focus on jumping up to the box because they're, you know, learning how to like get that height. But what's funny is like you can kind of teach yourself how to get that height naturally, you know, just by teaching yourself how to be more reactive. It kind of comes, you know, as part of it. So we were sort of assessing for that. Obviously, you know, the LESS test is actually something you're not going to see in your regular textbook. That is actually in your performance enhancement specialist textbook. So that is going to be in our program design class at the end of this month. So on Friday, we'll finish up this course. And then on Monday, we'll be getting into leadership, business, and sales is what it's called, which is basically like, I don't know why it's called leadership, but the business part of it's really important because like you need to know how to have a resume and a cover letter that is kind of synced up with the regular standards of our industry. So we're going to help you guys build that. The homework for that's going to be a little unique. I'm actually working on some online Google Docs that you guys can download and edit either on your phone or on an actual computer. And so by the end of it, everybody will have, and then what usually happens is like inevitably somebody runs into like small formatting problems and they're like, oh, I can't figure out how to make this not italic, you know? And usually I will help kind of just step in and kind of work with you guys on your resumes. So we might even be doing some stuff in the next class where we actually go through like our normal lecture, but it'll be really, really fast. And then normally there's a lot of practical time in this next class. Like normally, like when we're at Sochi, it's like, okay, guys, go to computer labs. For those of you who are really good at computers, you might wrap up early today. Then you're gonna head to the gym and go do a workout. If you're working on the computers for the whole class today, it's okay as well. And I'm gonna be here to help. So it's kind of like a self-propelled stuff a lot of times. So in this version, since we might still be stuck at home, we might actually be doing like some individual Zoom calls where I can kind of like get on with you and like actually help one-on-one. But that's some stuff we'll only have like 2 days of that if we do, or at least 2 days of that as part of the structure. Then after that class is over, after the leadership, business, and sales is over, we'll go into the program design sports class. And that's where, when you're training athletes, you know, all of these movement compensations we've been talking about until now become much more important, because now you're not trying to train somebody for the stresses of everyday life. You're training somebody for maximal exertion effort. So those non-contact injuries become a lot more prevalent. You know, don't get me wrong, they have a leg up because like they're athletic and they probably exercise fairly regularly. So that puts them, you know, that drives their risk down, but they're putting themselves in an environment that is much like higher risk. So we have those more advanced versions of assessment. You know, the landing error scoring system isn't necessarily designed to tell you about someone's posture. It's just designed to tell you about their risk for injury. But you can use it as a postural assessment because you can still see like somebody might have like a great overhead squat, you know, like my knees are tracking directly over my toes here, you know, when I squat like that. But if I jump, you know, who knows, maybe I get this like knee buckling sensation. And it's like, okay, so you're good under a normal pressure, but when you use maximal exertion, your posture breaks down still. So all that to kind of prime us up and kind of get us all into posture thinking mode, we got to look at our upper body stuff today, right? So upper body is the same concept. You do want to make sure that this is hard enough, similar to the gait assessment, similar to the LESS test, right? The reason that we start to see like more postural distortions is because like the effort is much higher. So the effort in this is also going to be relatively high, but it's still going to be manageable. So what you're going to be looking at, this is our pushing and our pulling assessment. A lot of times, NASM puts these into the same category because like the joint actions are actually the same. They're just in reverse, right? So like the pushing assessment is literally going to be like pushing. And since I don't have anything in my hands, you can't really tell if I'm pushing or pulling. Well, that's because the joint actions are the same. This is a push, this is a pull. The assessment is identical in both directions. So because the joint actions are the same, we're going to have the same kinetic chain checkpoints as we would between the two. And then if you look at NASM's like observations check sheet, like if you look at like observations chart, whatever, it's on the downloads. Just go to the forums. Postural client assessment. So when you look at like, if you go to NASM's downloads and you look at their assessment here, you know, you can see feet turn out, you got left and right, knees cave in. This is kind of funny, like you've got left and right here because if they have an asymmetric shift, they might be caving in on one and caving out on the other. So you would say like, you know, is it in or is it out, and is it on the left or is it on the right? However, if you have like one in and one out, and that is one on the left and one on the right, you got to draw yours. Do they have an excessive forward lean, which is another part of what we're looking at today? Does their low back arch, again, what we're looking at today. But then you go down to your single leg squat, you know, over here. And then you can kind of see like these things are really two-dimensional, right? Like it's not so much like left arm, right arm. You're just going to look for do they have trouble with pushing motions, these three here, or do they struggle with pulling motions? So, you know, before we were kind of looking like almost as if we were observing like the sagittal plate, like left and right for a lot of things, right? But now we're kind of looking more like, is it an anterior or a posterior problem? Is it an upper or a lower problem, right? We're looking, is it pushing, is it pulling? So it's a little bit of a tone change, but obviously, like, at the end of the day, the big thing we are observing is like what proper posture should look like, and if they are falling outside of those normal ranges. So again, kind of finishing, kind of continuing on with our notes from Friday here. We've got the pushing assessment. And what that's going to be, actually, hold on one second. I do want to make sure that these are consistent between our notes. I always like to make sure they look the same in terms of formats. I'm going to open up Friday's notes here and have them side by side just so I can copy the format here. So this would be under dynamic posture assessments. Oops. Again, this is dynamic, right? Because I can't automatically indent. I guess we'll put a renote here. Okay. Body position. Got it. Cool. Close. Okay. So our pushing assessment is going to be an upper body postural assessment that assesses dynamic flexibility, core strength, and upper body control. So we are looking, to see if somebody knows how to move their upper body the way that it's designed to, right? Like, do they have proper joint actions, or are they making movement compensation? Do they have that like synergistic dominance, right? And just to kind of review, like, those kind of key terms here, right? When we look at posture, when we're observing posture, right, we have, what often happens is you'll experience a little bit of like altered reciprocal inhibition, right? So altered reciprocal inhibition is where a tight agonist muscle is decreasing the neural drive to its antagonist, right? So like my pecs are so tight, they're keeping my rhomboids or middle trapezius from being able to move, right? My horizontal adductors are preventing my horizontal abductors from doing what they need to, right? That's altered reciprocal inhibition. It's like reciprocal inhibition, except it's messed up, right? This muscle's supposed to relax and it doesn't. So then what ends up happening is like maybe a synergist muscle will try to take over. Like my middle trapezius should be in charge of scapular retraction, right? Like my middle trapezius should be doing that shoulder retraction. But if my middle trapezius is like inhibited because maybe another muscle is super overactive, what might end up happening is a synergist muscle will kind of step in to kind of try to get the joint action done. It'll try to help, right? So what ends up happening is like, let's say I'm doing like a row, right? I'm supposed to row like this, but instead what ends up happening is I elevate my shoulders like crazy like that. So every time I row, I tend to like hike my shoulders up at the same time. And you guys see this in the gym a lot, by the way. If you've ever like glanced around at other folks in the gym and you notice that some people like hold their shoulders up like that, that's what's happening here. Is their upper trapezius is like, hey, I pull a little bit towards the spine. And so like it tries to like step in and help because it's so used to getting worked for other reasons. Like maybe this person has like a stressful job, so they do those shallow breathing patterns all day. And so now their upper trapezius is slightly overactive. Or maybe it's just because like I said, those scapular protractors are overactive. So my scapular retractors can't do their job, right? So because there's altered reciprocal inhibition, a synergist steps in to kind of help. Now, if that has been happening all the time, which, you're living with your posture 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, if that happens all the time, then that synergist gets better and better and better at working. But again, remember, it's not really designed to do this job. So it's probably pulling in the wrong direction slightly, right? Like, yeah, like my upper traps is, there's a little bit of scapular retraction. It's attached, if we look at the upper traps, it's attached similarly, although it's not the same, right? Trapezius muscles, if we look at all of them here together, you know, my upper traps, which is hidden behind the Zoom call. Good Lord, that's a big picture today. You know, that's this portion up here. My middle traps is this middle portion. You can see like this is kind of still pulling towards the center, but the problem is that it's also pulling into elevation. That's the issue here, right? Whereas my lower and middle traps are supposed to kind of pull this way. So what ends up happening is I move with an altered joint mechanic. I've got that synergistic dominance. And then what that leads to is me moving the wrong way, which puts more stress on my skeletal system and could lead to things like shoulder impingement. So that's really what, you know, kind of what we're looking for. So when it comes to our body position, we've got to kind of line ourselves up into a neutral place so that we are observing like the joint, like we're putting the joint in a position where it should be able to work exactly as it's designed. But if it can't, that's where we're going to start to see compensation. So our body position is going to be instruct client to draw abdomen in, feet. Somebody just join in? No. Feet shoulder width apart. And toes pointed forward. All right, so they are going to have sort of that natural chest press position that you would normally do if you were doing like a cable chest press. Notice, by the way, she's lining up. Normally, like a lot of cable machines are going to have like this little like ball here that keeps the cable from going too far into the machine. You want to line that up basically directly along like their collarbone's length. I also don't mind lowering it just slightly as long as your client doesn't get too much rubbing sensation on like their forearm here. You got to be a little bit cautious because that cable will often like, you know, they're holding on to it here and then it comes around the back of the wrist and then travels back. Occasionally that will cause like a rubbing sensation. So if your client's got like lots of arm hair, be cautious with that. And then your movement is going to be, instruct client to press handles forward as in a chest press and return slowly. Now, when you're doing this, one thing that's not in the PowerPoint here is that you want to do it at a 202 tempo. Perform at a 202 tempo. So you're just going at a perfectly medium tempo here. We don't really care about isometrics. We're just trying to observe this person as they are moving. So it's not important for us. You know, we're not trying to develop stability here. We're not even training our client. We're just observing their posture. So tempo is really just a medium tempo as you would kind of normally. In fact, your client will probably naturally move at the tempo you really want them to, but it's always good to give instruction. And then you're going to perform up to 20 repetitions. So pick a weight that the client can perform around 20 repetitions. And what we mean by that is if they can do 20, it is, if they can do more than 20, it is too light, okay? So just be aware of that. We do want to go for around 20 repetitions overall. You're trying to observe their posture the entire time. And the reason we're picking, you might be a little surprised when you hear 20 because it's like, man, we definitely didn't do 20 overhead squats. Why are we doing so many on the upper body? And remember, if we go back to talking about like our special populations class, what's one of the downfalls of doing high repetitions in the upper body? What's like a population that you need to be cautious about when it comes to upper body exercises in particular, because it might make them feel very uncomfortable? Anybody remember? I don't know if I worded that properly, but let's see if anybody can think of what I'm thinking of. What's associated with upper body exercise that's not associated with lower body exercise? I'll give you a hint.
Does it have to do with the respiratory?
It does, yeah. Not necessarily actual lung dysfunction, but remember,
Cardio?
usually if we're training somebody who has lung dysfunction, we got to be
Hmm.
cautious about upper body exercises because it puts you into a position where you have trouble breathing and can lead to dyspnea, right? That shortness of breath. So we actually want to do a high number of repetitions here because if somebody does have any of those shortness of breath problems, they're going to start activating those postural muscles that we are looking for, right? Those altered postural muscles, those muscles that really shouldn't be doing any work. Those start to show up in a higher repetition range. Your traps are a type 1 muscle fiber. These are endurance fibers. I know everybody's thinking of like, going to the gym and doing super heavy like shoulder shrugs and stuff. And it's like, hey, I can shrug a lot of weight. I'm sure you can, but like these are like postural muscles, which means they are used under a lot of tension. Well, not a lot of tension, but a lot of time under tension, like all day long. Your posture is keeping you upright right now, except for Jay, who I think is laying down. But like it's, keeping you up all freaking day. We need to do higher repetitions if we're going to stress this type of our body, if we're going to observe those postural distortions. So it's kind of tied to similarly why we got to be cautious with those populations. It's because of the higher repetition stuff. So what you're going to look for, your movement compensations, right? Your observation views. You are only going to do lateral. So the only view you're going to do is a lateral view. Nothing fancy about that, actually. Hold on one second. I'll pull this up one more time. Okay, yeah. And then from the lateral view, you are going to look at the lumbo pelvic hip complex, the shoulder complex, and the head. So those are the the 3 spots you're looking at. 4. I can count. So taking a look right here, right? You can see if we're looking at the lumbopelvic hip complex, the only thing you're really looking for is, do they have an excessive low back arch, right? Are they getting that like Instagram booty when they go to do that pushing motion? So what this will often look like is this. You'll see somebody stand in a neutral position. I gotta make sure that I don't punch my wall here. So you're gonna push, and then what you'll start to see is as somebody gets like tighter and tighter and tighter, they'll start arching more and more and more. And they'll sometimes do this like awkward lean. They'll like push like this, where they start using their kind of body to help them. So what's happening there is, remember your lats, right? Your lat muscles are tying all the way down into that thoracolumbar fascia. And your latissimus dorsi does do just a little bit, like not a lot, but a little bit of like spinal extension. So when they're pushing, they're going into this like protracted position here. And sometimes that can put stretch on the latissimus dorsi, right? That can put this stretching sensation. Obviously, if that muscle doesn't want to stretch, it's going to kind of just go with it. And what that does is that pulls your thoracolumbar fascia into extension. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully I explained that right. So as they like start to push forward, right, it kind of causes this arching because their lat is sort of, rather than stretching out, it's staying in a bunched up, shortened state and pulling the bone, anteriorly and superiorly. So that's causing that that anterior pelvic tilt. So we'll look at that in just a second. Then we're also going to see shoulders elevating. We've kind of already talked. That was the kind of first example I started giving, right? We start to see somebody who, elevates their upper trapezius muscles even during a pushing motion. Your trapezius muscle is not in charge of anything when it comes to pressing. But again, if certain muscles lack the flexibility that they're supposed to have, or if they're just simply overactive, they just fire when they're not supposed to. This person doesn't know how to do this movement very comfortably, so then they kind of sink into just using their body just sinks into using muscles that it kind of knows how to recruit. You start to see shoulders elevating during the push. And so you'll see like this kind of thing. And then lastly, the most common is going to be that forward head posture. And so you'll see somebody who pushes and they'll actually reach with their head as they do. I'm trying to like see, am I doing it on the camera? So they'll reach with their head. They'll kind of do that. What's the character from Family Guy? He doesn't do it in the show anymore. He's did like the head bob thing. You'll start to see that a little bit in pushing motions. So those are the three main spots you are looking for here. So let's actually go through real quick and look at like what those movement compensations mean, right? So we'll get our probable overactive and probable underactive muscles out here. So I got to open up the CS solutions table. We're going to get this table open again. You guys will recognize from Friday's lesson. But if we scroll down, you'll notice that it has the forward head posture and the shoulder elevation from before. And then you're going to see like low back arching. Again, low back arching in like the pushing and pulling assessment means exactly the same things as it does in the overhead squat, right? Like, because the same muscles are causing that joint action. So particular, it's probably going to be the lats, could be the erector spinae as well. Hip flexors, not really having anything to do when it comes to like pushing. But again, if they're overactive and this person's like tightening up their body, there's no reason their hip flexors couldn't be involved. But particular, we're going to look at the lats. So let's take a look, right? So if we go, how did I do this? Copying, pasting so that I have a template. So pushing assessment, movement compensations. Let's look at the first one here, which is going to be low back arch. Our probable overactive and probable underactive. Okay, so our probable overactive muscles with the low back arching is going to be the same. If we go up to here, we're going to see the hip flexor complex again. And this is something we didn't necessarily have on Friday. Like we didn't do low back arch, like a full breakdown here, but we'll get into that in just a second. We're going to see the hip flexor complex. We are going to see the erector spinae, and we're going to see the latissimus dorsi. So now here's the thing about the overhead squat, because we're going to dive back into this in just a minute here. So kind of going back to Friday's lesson a little bit, right? We primarily looked at our anterior view, right? We looked at this and we looked at the feet. But you will sometimes see that anterior pelvic tilt as somebody squatting down. And you'll also sometimes see it in this like excessive like pushing motion. Now, here's what's kind of weird about this. Do you guys actually, this is a question pretty much only for Maggie. Maggie, you are the newest in the group. Normally I would pick on a mod 1 student. But what do you notice if we look at these probable overactive muscles? What do you notice that's kind of weird here? Like you've got the hip flexor complex, the erector spinae, and the lats. Like what doesn't fit? Like what muscle like almost doesn't seem like it, almost like it doesn't belong, you know?
The lats. That would be
yeah, it's a little weird, right? Like you think of an anterior pelvic tilt, you've got like the hip flexors, of course, right? Of course that's causing an anterior tilt, right? This is pulling down in the front. Meanwhile, the erector spinae is pulling up in the back, right? The lats are kind of out of place, right? They're these big muscles way up here. But again, kind of going back to what we already mentioned, it inserts into your thoracolumbar fascia, and so it can pull you into spinal extension. But here's the thing. That's a very much like an above the waist problem versus the hip flexor complex, which is like a below the waist problem. So there's kind of a disconnect there. How do you determine, and I know some of you guys already know this, but how do you determine whether or not the lat is causing the overhead squat problem, or if the hips are causing the overhead squat problem? Because in the overhead squat, right, my lats are only under a stretch when I take my arms up, right? That's the only time I'm gonna get the big arch, is when I like take my arms up like this. Like if I take my arms up and I stay totally neutral, then it's probably not my lats, right? So if I'm doing the overhead squat, and I've got a client who experiences a low back arching, you've got to take your squat, you've got to take your assessment one step farther. You actually need to do a special modification in order to determine, like, is it below the waist or is it above the waist? Like, where's the root cause of this problem? And so what you do is you have your client, if your client does have a low back arch when they squat, right? They do this real big, intense arch here. What you need to have them do is you need to have them take their arms down. I actually like to have my clients cross their arms like this when they do it, and then squat again. Now, if they still look like this, or if they still have this excessive like arch, then we know the hips are the big bad guy here, right? Because like taking their arms down didn't help at all. But if they go like this, right, they got this big arch, and then they take their arms down, and then they squat, and their squat goes into a perfectly like neutral like spine, you know that the reason, like, I'm gonna try and do this, and don't have your clients do this, like this is a lot of dynamic movement in their posture, but basically it would look something kind of like this. They would squat into a good neutral posture like that, but then as they do this, the arch comes back, right? You know that it's because, you know that that's because like as their lat was pulled into shoulder flexion, which is a stretched eccentric position for this muscle, that's what caused the low back arching. So that's something you're gonna look for in your overhead squat. And in your pushing, pulling, you're gonna observe, like, do they arch as well, right? And that means that there's like upper body dysfunction. That means the exact same things, but there is no way to modify the pushing and pulling assessment. So we kind of revisit, we kind of circle back around to our overhead squat there. Does that make sense to everybody? Everybody tracking that so far pretty well?
Yep.
Cool, cool. All right, let's throw this up here. Okay, so our probable overactive muscles, hip flexors, erector spinae, latissimus dorsi. Probable underactive muscles, going back to our list here. It seems like a long list. You're gonna notice it's like, holy crap, that's a big box. But it's because it's actually listing out all the little submuscles there. So it is going to be opposite of your hip flexor complex, right? That's in charge of hip flexion. So we got to look at our hip extensors. That's going to be your gluteus maximus. And remember, your hamstring muscles do assist with a little bit of like weak hip extension. So because hip flexion is sort of the big thing that they're doing more than they need to, their gluteus, their hamstring muscles are going to be helpful here as well. So hamstrings, right? Now notice when it says hamstrings, we're not saying like biceps femoris short head, right? We are saying the whole hamstring. So if you are trying to strengthen your client's hamstrings, you got to make sure you keep them in alignment with a nice straight leg as they do. Like if they're doing like a hinging motion, they need to keep in alignment there, not open up like this. Because if they open up like that, or I mean, this never happens, but like if they were to go super far in this direction as well, right? That would either be way too much on the lateral or way too much on the medial side. We want to work the whole hamstring. And then the big one we're going to see here, and this is particularly relevant to the pushing assessment. It's relevant to both, but it's especially relevant to this pushing assessment, is going to be the underactive muscle is going to be your intrinsic core stabilizers. And if you remember going back to our kinesiology class, what our intrinsic core stabilizers are, right? This is not just your abs, right? This is like where I did that big rant where I was like, look, there's a difference between your core and abs. Like, those are not the same things. Your core is everything surrounding your spine and below it, right? So the intrinsic core stabilizers, rather than just focusing on like the muscles that move you into spinal flexion, like your rectus abdominis, we're going to look instead at your transverse abdominis. Right, like that's going to be our ab muscle that really stabilizes us in the front there, right? It's designed to like hold your spine in place in the front. And then you're going to look at your, let's go ahead and go to the back here. That's an eye, by the way. Abdominis. Let's look at so we've stabilized in the front. Let's stabilize in the back here. We had the erector spinae as overactive, right? So if I look at like my low back, remember our erector spinae, I'll have pulled a picture here. There are these big muscles running along, you know, all the way from the top here, all the way down, right? So that's why that's causing spinal extension. That's what your erector spinae does, is it pulls you back this way. If your abs crunch you forward, your erector spinae pulls you backwards, right? And it does, and by the way, it assists a little bit this way as well, right? There's a little bit of rotation stuff. But like that's its main job. But if you look at your multifidus, these are actually all the little individual tiny muscles, and this is all underneath your erector spinae, right? Like this is the innermost layer, right? And that's kind of similar to what we're looking at when we look at our transverse abdominis. It's this like stabilizing inner layer, right? That's wrapping around and like stabilizing everything. It's creating intra-abdominal pressure. And then if you look at your rectus abdominis, you can see it's going to be that outermost layer that's like stabilizing on top, right? Let's see if I can find a good lateral view here. Not helping, internet. Not helping me out today. Kinda. I mean, this is kind of what I'm looking for. But you can kind of see, like, right there's the rectus and then the transverse there. Not perfect, but basically two layers, right? They're kind of wrapping like this on top, one on top of the other. So we are really trying to strengthen the innermost layer, right? That's your transverse abdominis and your multifidus. Then we've got some that are going to be, you know, now that you've stabilized the front and you've stabilized the back, now you got to stabilize the sides, right? And so that is going to be your inner oblique muscles, right? Your inside oblique muscles. So we're going to call that the internal obliques, right? And that's going to be on the left side and the right side. And then you're going to see the pelvic floor muscles be part of that as well. That's stabilizing like the bottom. That's giving you like upward pressure. And then you've got your diaphragm giving you downward pressure, right? So if you kind of think of it, when you think of like your intrinsic core stabilizers, one of the easiest ways to remember this is to think of it as like a box, right? You've got the front of the box, you've got the back of the box, you've got both sides of the box, the bottom and the top. That's creating stability so that your spine stays in place, right? All of that pushing in creates that intra-abdominal pressure. And that's really what we're talking about there. That's keeping each of your individual discs in place. So if you have a client who is trying to stabilize their spine by, you know, contracting their erector spinae, that's creating spinal movement rather than spinal stability, right? So this is definitely a person that, you know, has like a weakened core. You know, they might be like, that doesn't make any sense. I do, you know, group exercise classes where I do all this like, you know, crunches and stuff, I do my, you know, I got my, what was the old 8-minute abs, right? I do my 8-minute abs DVD every other day. You know, it's like, well, that may be true, but that's focusing a lot on moving your spine, which you are quite good at. What I need you to get good at is stabilizing your spine. I need you to be able to hold your spine in place while we do a movement such as a chest press. So those are going to be your probable underactive muscles if your client has a low back arch in both the pushing assessment, the pulling assessment, and in the overhead squat. But I do want to go do one special, actually we won't do it on here, we'll do it on the overhead. Any questions on that so far, guys? How are we feeling?
So the idea here would be to do planks to strengthen the.
Yep. I mean, you can do planks, you can do dead bugs, V-sits, what's another, side planks.
Yeah.
You know, floor
what's your favorite?
bridges. Floor bridges would be a really good one. Like, don't be surprised if you get like plenty of abdominal activation when you do like a hip raise, you know? Like, we primarily think of that as a glute ham exercise, but like it
Yeah.
can be great for, you know, as long as your client is like, remember the best way to like engage your core is to like, if it's kind of in a rested position, right? You want to do two things. You want to brace, which is like drawing everything in, and you want to draw in. You want to pull your belly button toward your spine. Both of those things, particularly pulling your belly button toward your spine, is a great way to activate your transverse abdominis and all of those stabilizer muscles. So yes, plank is good, but like we just want to continue, like, you know, is your client doing a shoulder press? Hey, pull that belly button in. Is your client doing you know, are they on the leg press machine, which I hate, but we'll use as an example. Pull that belly button in, right? Like, we want them to be activating their core as much as possible.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if this is true, but this woman I used to work with, she was like and you know, maybe it was because this lady was crazy. But she's like ex-military, super tough, like, you know, and like she had a rep at our gym. Like, you know, like if you wanted like the ass kick trainer, you went with Troy. Like, she wrecked people. And she said one time, as like a personal challenge to herself, she drove like from LA to San Francisco for some reason, and on there she decided to consciously pull her belly button toward her spine and hold it there for the course of the trip. Because she would always say that, like that was like her big note. It was like, you doing a bench press, pull your belly button in. You're doing a barbell squat, pull your belly button in. Like, you're doing crunches, pull your belly button in. You know, like she was, that was like her big note. She would constantly tell
Sounds
people.
like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, she was like really dogmatic about it. And so she said she was like getting cramping like the next day because it was just like she had activated her core like so much. It was like, you know, 6 hours of driving. Or however long San Francisco is. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot.
I don't know if it's, I like, you know, I cannot confirm nor deny that, but like, to me, that sounds insane. I've tried to do it at just red lights before.
It does,
And,
yeah.
you know, by the end of a trip, your abs are humming, you know? So that's going to be our first one, right? We're going to see low back arch. This is our first big movement compensation. Now, anybody have any questions about that before we move on to the next one? Cool. So let's look at shoulders elevate, because this is going to be another one of our very, very common compensations. Probable overactive muscles. So if your client experiences like shoulder elevation, which, holy crap, in the world of cell phones, you are going to see. So this is going to be right here. Our probable overactive muscles are going, by the way, this table is messed up slightly on their website. It always has like the sternocleidomastoid levator. I don't know why they did that. Anyway, the formatting nerd in me hates it. Your overactive muscles are all going to be those muscles that, you know, elevate your scapula. So we are going to see the upper trapezius. That's going to be like a big bad here, like a big bad guy. And then you are going to see your levator scapulae, which again does that elevation, but also that anterior tilt. And then you're going to see the sternocleidomastoid. Your sternocleidomastoid isn't so much in charge of like elevation, but it does ever so slightly lift your collarbone, which allows like the rest of the shoulder elevation to happen easier. So it's definitely like guilty through association here. You know, your sternocleidomastoid is primarily in charge of like this type of motion. But remember, it does ever so slightly lift your collarbone. So like when I lift my collarbone, that allows the tilting to happen. And now my levator's like, cool, I can go to town, you know? It didn't steal the jewels, but it opened the door. So, so let's go ahead and look at our overactive, right? That's gonna be upper trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, love that word, and levator scapulae, right? So those are going to be your probable overactive muscles. And then obviously if we're experiencing too much shoulder elevation, we need to look at shoulder depression. So our probable underactive muscles that is going to be your middle and lower trapezius. Right? So your middle traps are mostly in charge of like scapular protraction, but really, you know, I'm gonna put these on separate lists. Just, I know it's got it listed like this, but I want to give them, put it like that, just because particularly your low traps here are really, really like one of our most underactive. Your low traps, which are pulling you into scapular depression, right? They are in particular not getting a lot of work. Now remember, they are also still in charge of a little bit of like, you know, retraction, right? Primarily, this is my middle trapezius, right? Pulling my scapula together. But my lower trapezius pulls it down and back, right? Like that is designed to kind of pull, if you think of your shoulder blades as like resting behind your back like this, it pulls them like that, pulls them downwards towards the middle. So if your client has way too much of this going on, which if any of you listening to this lecture are doing your shoulders as much as I am during this demo, good Lord, you are going to need that today. I'm about to show you some stretches and I am looking forward to it. You know, those lower traps are really going to need to be active there. There's a lot of really great ways to do this. One of the best ones is just like that classic like YTA. When you do like overhead Y motions like this, that's actually a surprisingly good way to strengthen your low traps. You might not think of like, you know, this Y motion as like scapular depression, but when you stabilize your scapula down and back as you move your arm through like a range of motion like this, it may not necessarily be like an intense concentric contraction for that low trap, but it is a really good like isometric one. The way I always like to picture it is like, it's almost like if you've ever seen like a Lord of the Rings movie or like a castle movie where there's like, or even just like rock climbing, where there's like a rope going over like the edge of something, and there's somebody on the other end who's like pulling back like this on the rope as it like cascades over. That's kind of what your low traps are doing. They're pulling down on the bottom of your scapula, creating like isometric stability as your scapula moves through this other range of motion. I just kicked my butt. I've been doing so many low back arch demos today that my low back is actually very turned on. So as you move your arm over like this, the lower part of your scapula has to kind of pull down and stabilize there. So those Y-ing motions are a really great way to strengthen your low traps, even though it may seem more like an anterior deltoid exercise. Like this is very concentric, yes, but it's very isometric in your low traps. So that's a really, really good one. One of my other favorites that is like relatively intense, so not necessarily every client can do it, but is like hanging from a pull-up bar and doing just this little tiny range of motion right here. Just this little, like you keep your arms totally straight and you just do a dead hang, but you just pull down like that. Just a little bit of scapular depression. So you're trying to pinch your shoulder blades down and back together. It's a great way to strengthen your low traps. One of my all-time favorite exercises, even though it doesn't look like it's doing much. Then we got our rhomboids, right? Again, scapular retractors, right? Just like your middle trapezius here. And then lastly, one of our other underactive ones could be the rotator cuff. Now your rotator cuff is not just like one muscle, it's a series of muscles, but they're kind of like putting the whole thing here. So if what does my rotator cuff have to do with elevating my shoulders? Like, why do you think that's on the list? I'll give you a hint. I'm kind of trapping you. It's almost a trick question. Come on. Go back to what we were looking at before, right? Intrinsic core stabilizers weren't working. What does my rotator cuff do?
Rotates the shoulder.
It does do that, but it also, you've heard me say this before, it's the core of your shoulder. Like when people are talking about core training, I am part of a weird, tiny subset of people. For the record, your core is your lumbopelvic hip complex. I will accept that. But when it comes to core training, if you ask me, rotator cuff training should be part of it. Like, no, this is not actually part of your core. I get it. I know it's nowhere near my spine, but it is stabilizing my scapula, which is attaching my whole freaking arm onto my body. So when it comes to like core training, your rotator cuff is like the transverse abdominis and the multifidus and the internal obliques of your scapula, right? So let's look at that rotator cuff. Let's look at, all these little individual muscles here. You got to remember, this is providing stability inside of your glenohumeral joint, right? So if we look at this, right, this is your glenoid cavity, right? It's this little gap that your scapula has here that perfectly fits like a ball-shaped bone, and that ball-shaped bone happens to be the head of your humerus, right? So this is your glenohumeral joint, and you can see here's your supraspinatus, this little tiny muscle that runs along the back. It runs on the top of your spine of your scapula, right, which is this like little ridge back here. So your supraspinatus runs there, and then it runs into the front and attaches right on, providing some stability on top. Then you've got your subscapularis, which is below the scapula, right? It's kind of, tucked underneath it. That's your subscapularis, right? And it's going to run and, again, provide stability there. And then in the back, probably one of our primary ones, is your teres minor, this little tiny muscle that runs along the ridge here around the outside of your shoulder and provides stability in the front. So until now, we were kind of looking at the top, we were looking at the front, now we're looking at the back, right? Now we're looking very similarly to like building a box in our core, right? You've got top, you don't really have bottom, but you have front, you have side, and you have back, right? All of these muscles coming around surrounding the bone to manipulate it in all of these different ranges of motion. Remember, it's a ball and socket joint, right? It is the most mobile joint in your entire body. So because of that, one thing that comes with increased mobility is decreased stability, right? Because of how mobile it is, unfortunately, it is prone to injury, especially in people who don't have a stabilized rotator cuff. So that is where, doing exercises that focus on stability, like I love the cable chest press, but I really love the single leg cable chest press, because that unstable exercise is going to activate my rotator cuff. My rotator cuff is going to learn how to stabilize in all of those different ranges of motion. Now, in particular, one of our really weak muscles here that you're going to see in that rotator cuff is going to be the teres minor. right? That's that one in the back that is in charge of external rotation. And the reason why that one tends to really lose the fight is because, like, again, it's in charge of external rotation, and you've got, what's one of our muscles that's in charge of internal rotation, guys?
The lat.
The freaking lats, that giant muscle, right? That thing that runs the entire length of my back. My bacon strip of a Terry's Minor has to work against that guy. You know, that is the ultimate David versus Goliath. So, and then again, you know, you get your Terry's Major on the other side. So both of Terry's Major and lat are both working to internally rotate someone's shoulders, and your Terry's Minor is there like, I got this, you know, like trying to like rotate the opposite direction. So that's not hugely relevant to, you know, the elevation part of things, but you can understand if somebody has problems stabilizing and these big muscles like the sternocleidomastoid or the levator or the upper trapezius tries to do the stabilizing for the rotator cuff, it will result in an elevated shoulder. You know, just like if I try to stabilize my spine, but instead I do a crunch, or if I stabilize my spine and instead I do, you know, a low back arch, you know, that is stable. Those are mover muscles trying to do stability. That's not really their job. Their job is to do lots of concentric, eccentric stuff, not isometric. All right, and so that is shoulders elevating. Any questions or comments on that? All right. Let's look at our last one here, which is going to be forward head posture. So really, again, kind of looking at the upper cross stuff, right? Our probable overactive muscles, same list, right? We're going to see the levator scapulae. What'd I do? Oh, probable overactive muscles first. Right? That's going to be a big one there. We're also going to see the sternocleidomastoid again. And then we're going to see the scalenes. And your scalenes are very, very similar to your upper trapezius. So if we look at upper trapezius, right, that is going to be, where's the colored one? There we go. This one's always really nice. You know, this portion of the trap muscles in the back, there's your middle trapezius there, and the kind of middle red, and then that dark red is going to be the lower traps. But you can see like the upper one here. And then if you look at your scalenes, they are these little tiny muscles on the side here. You've got some anterior and posterior ones. The anterior ones attached to the collarbone, and the posterior ones actually run down and insert right here. So as you're looking at this, oh, there we go. That's a great picture. So you can see here those scalene muscles. Actually, do we still got Arlene on the call? Oh man, Arlene will tell you.
Yes,
You can get some massage here, right? You can massage those scalenes, but
Yep.
oh, what a nightmare. This is my number one, like, least favorite, like, don't touch me there spot.
They are very tight.
Yeah, this is a very, very common thing. I think it's just the world, again, the world we live in. Like, we're on cell phones, you know, we like to prop ourselves up like on our side, like all that elevation and like forward head posture, all that like really intense scalene stuff there. So when you're doing your upper trap stretch, you know, you can go directly to the side. If you want to get a bit of a scalene stretch, you're gonna need to slightly look upwards. And then if you want to get, at least for the anterior scalenes, your middle scalenes, you can kind of get just like, you're getting them at the same time you're getting your upper traps. But remember, this is also attaching to like that collarbone. So what you need to do is you need to actually depress the arm further away. Now, the other thing is when your arm is in internal rotation, that tends to round here. So that takes the stretch off the collarbone. So you also want to draw your arm into external rotation. So try to follow along with this as I walk you guys through it. But we're going to go through a scalene stretch right now. So take your head and just drop your left ear over to your left shoulder. Just drop it like that. You'll feel your upper trap stretch. You'll feel that stretch like right along the side immediately. But now roll your shoulders up, down, and back, right? So kind of go through and then depress your shoulders down as you're holding that there. And now you're going to feel it a little bit more. It's going to travel backward just a little bit. Now what I want you to do is you've got this hand here, right? The opposite side hand. I want you to imagine your keys are on a little tiny like table right here, and they're just out of reach. And you're like, reach just a little bit. And draw that down as you're doing this with your thumb up. And then if you want to go even further, if this is already a deep enough stretch, go ahead and relax there. But if you want to go a little bit deeper into this, what you can do is you can actually draw that hand back slightly. And that'll go even deeper. And you'll feel that all the way out. That should travel all the way out to right about here, like all the way down. And that is getting your entire trap and your scalenes at the same time. And now everybody do the other. Oh, God. My cervical spine did not move how it was supposed to. I tried to go to the other side, and I was so loose over here and so tight over here, because this is like a real problem that I have, that my neck was just like, clink, nope. All right, so do the other side. Again, you're gonna lean ever so slightly up, arm out, reach, and back. And that should be your entire upper trap section. It's a good one. It's a really good stretch that, you know, if you have a forward head posture, AKA if you own a cell phone, this is a stretch you're gonna wanna do. So there's your scalenes there, the little tiny ones underneath your traps. I mean, they're not necessarily underneath, like they're there and they are exposed, but they kind of run parallel, but your traps are so large, they kind of feel like they're underneath. And then we got your underactive muscles. We're only gonna have one on the list here. Deep cervical flexors. Now that one sometimes surprises people, right? When you hear deep cervical flexors, let's go ahead and look these up real quick. If you look at your deep cervical flexors, you're gonna see these little tiny muscles that are running along the front of your neck. They run up under your chin like this, and then they run straight down. So here's some extra, you can see some extra ones there. You can see those scalenes actually. Yeah, I mean, I like this, but good Lord, we do not need to have the eyeballs in there. Okay, there we go. You can kind of see it when it zooms out a little bit. It's just like, oh, I guess you can kind of see it in this one. All right, we'll go with the creepy eyeball picture. So you can see this runs right onto the top of your sternocleidomastoid there, right? That kind of little dent that you see in there is in between those two cervical flexors. So this is right now, and you've got your longest capitis, which runs about halfway down, and you've got your longest coli, which runs all the way down. Coli or coli, if you want to say it that way. Both those run the entire length there. Now, this one sometimes gets surprising because people are like, wait a minute. These muscles on the front of the neck are underactive when I pull to the front too much. And that sometimes seems kind of weird, right? Because you're like, why would a muscle in the front, which would probably pull to the front, be underactive when I have too much of that anterior motion, right? Well, you got to remember that these muscles are in charge of stabilizing your neck, right? So like when you look down, you should be looking down like this, right? That's what they're there for, you know, and so that's actually helping stabilize your head in this upward position like this. So these muscles are actually stabilizers in the front. This is, again, kind of that similar problem. It's just pulling in a different direction, right? This is similar to, again, you know, rather than your stabilizers working, you're crunching. You're not stabilizing, you're moving, right? Sternocleidomastoid is moving you rather than stabilizing you. So this isn't exactly an example of altered reciprocal inhibition, this is more of an example of synergistic dominance, right? These synergist muscles are taking over for these muscles that are supposed to stabilize, just like somebody whose shoulders are elevating rather than their rotator cuff. So I always think of this whenever I think of like the upper body dysfunction. When you're looking at these muscles, it gets a lot less into altered reciprocal inhibition. These are a lot of examples of that synergistic dominance. But either way, all of it, whether it's altered reciprocal or synergistic, all of it's bad, and all of it causes altered joint motions. So let's go ahead and look at the pulling assessment here. Your pulling assessment, exactly the same concept, right? Except going in the opposite direction. So now you're going to, you're still in a split stance there, doing that like cable row. You're going to hold on to the cable machine here, and you're going to pull straight in like this. You can, by the way, like NASM has all of its demos in like working into shoulder extension, like in a neutral grip. If you want to, you can do a pronated grip. However, if you do, you got to remember that like you focused on horizontal adduction and abduction for both assessments, rather than addressing horizontal adduction and abduction and shoulder extension and shoulder flexion. So you were looking at like two different things. This is why like most of their demos have you doing this version. But if you start to know, like let's say they do their pushing assessment and it's fine. They do their pulling assessment and you notice a compensation. You do their pushing assessment and it's fine, and you do your pulling assessment and it's also fine. You can always do your second set in this version to see if like that causes dysfunction. You can do both versions if you want. There's nothing, wrong with doing that. It's just not in your book. And I just bring it up because like I've had students who like go work for Equinox and stuff, and Equinox is going to teach you their assessment style. It's all going to be variations of this, like this is the same assessments all trainers use across the whole industry, but like they'll have like their system, and I think they only do this version. So I've had students come back and be like, they didn't let us do it this way. It's like, well, doesn't matter what they let you do, like both are good. You can do both. You're not going to get in trouble for doing one or the other. All right, so we're going to put the polling assessment here. So I'm back on this line. Yeah. So this is exactly the same definition here, right? It's an upper body postural assessment that assesses dynamic flexibility, core strength, and upper body control. So we can actually just put that same definition down here. And then we're just going to set up the position here. Instruct client to draw abdomen in, feet stand with feet shoulder width apart and toes pointing forward. Your movements, same concept. Instruct client to pull handles toward the body and return slowly. Right, and for the record, again, I'm just going to put a little like sub note here. Can be performed with shoulder extension or horizontal abduction. Both work. Did I do that right? Yeah. Perform up to 20 repetitions. Same concept here, right? We want to do high repetitions because that's really where, oh, I forgot, I want to copy this. And that's really where we start to see those compensations, right? And this is also going to be at a 202 tempo, okay? We got a special little note here, right? It can be performed with this, but it should be at a 202 tempo. pick a weight that they can do for 20. If they can do more than 20, then the weight is going to be too light. And then our compensation views, right? That's how, is that what I said? Observation views. Observation views are just going to be lateral. That's the only one you're going to look at. And again, we're looking at the lumbopelvic hip complex, the shoulder complex, and head. So those are the main places we're looking at. Your compensations are going to be the same, right? You're going to look to see, does the low back arch? That's going to tell you the same overactive muscles as before. Do their shoulders elevate? That's going to tell you the same overactive muscles as before. Or do they have a forward head posture? By the way, this one and this one are going to be really common amongst your pulling assessments. I guess all of them are going to be really common during your pulling assessments. But this is where, you know, a lot of people actually start to run into trouble. Your compensation list is actually going to be exactly the same. So now that we've kind of already looked at all of this, I know this is kind of, hopefully this, well, for those of you who are taking notes at home as we go along, I know some people are getting the notes and then they recopy them down. For those of you who are taking notes like in this moment, draw an arrow up your notes. It is going to be all of the same stuff as before. But I am going to now modify this. I'm actually going to turn this into pushing/pulling assessment movement compensations. I'm going to move this whole list down to below for those of you who are doing this later. So now you're going to see pushing and pulling are right next to each other. And then underneath it will be all of the movement compensations for both. So for those of you who are going along with us, just draw an arrow up and it'll be like, see the same muscles as before. Like the movement compensation is the same, but hopefully that doesn't totally alter all your stuff. So those are your upper body posture assessments. Do you guys have any questions on that stuff right now? Pretty good? Okay, so that's really the big one that we kind of wanted to look at today. Now, one thing that we're going to kind of pivot into right now, we're going to pivot into designing a program for a client who has a low back arch. And we're also going to actually kind of skip back a little bit into the overhead squat. We're also going to look at an excessive forward lean, which doesn't have anything to do with the upper body stuff that we talked about today. We're going to get back to this upper body stuff actually like as we go through the rest of this course, through the rest of the week. But let's go ahead and build another example program. Is everybody feeling pretty good about all that? Cool. Told you it was going to be a shorter day. All right, let's get an OPT template out, shall we? I have no idea where it is on my desktop anymore. My desktop is such a mess since there's so many more. Normally, it's just a couple little files, all my video games. But now I work from home, and so now there's files everywhere. All right. So I do want to kind of minimize that. By the way, I'm still working on that master list that I'm going to send you guys. But let's look at an example here. How's my example from Friday? What did that look like? Day 8. Where's my example handout? What did I call this person? Nothing. Phase 1. I just did gold. Cool. Piece of cake. All right, we're gonna do 2 today, actually. For the record, you will very likely not see someone who has a low back arch and an excessive forward lean. Those two don't often go together, just because as soon as they lean forward, it takes the pressure off, and then they don't have to arch their low back anymore. So we're going to kind of build these side by side as if they're sort of 2 different people. We're just going to have them on one sheet. So let's look at our first person here. We're going to see, oh God, I totally forgot. How did I have it? Good Lord, come on. Example, feet turn out. Okay. Example, example, low back arch. Okay, let's put our client in phase 1 still, just because again, that is sort of where we correct most of these postural distortions. So again, going back to our client with a low back arch, right? Our probable overactive muscles when it comes to low back arching is going to be the hip flexor complex, the erector spinae, and the latissimus dorsi, but the lats could be an upper body dysfunction more so than lower body dysfunction. So if I had my client do the overhead squat and they kept they did this big intense low back arch as they did it, but then as I had them take their arms down, they still had that low back arch, we're going to say it's lower body dysfunction. We're looking at an anterior pelvic tilt. And so that's actually what I'm going to put here as kind of a sub note. We're going to say anterior pelvic tilt. So it might not necessarily be the lats that are the big bad here, right? Which means that I might not necessarily have to put as much stress on them, but it doesn't mean that I can't foam roll those as well. So on my SMR here, I'm going to go SMR. We're going to go hip flexors, right? So your hip flexors, when you label it like that on your SMR, you're usually talking about like right on the front of that rectus femoris, right? So if you look at your hip flexor complex, primarily the big things we're talking about are usually your iliopsoas, which is like this iliacus and your psoas muscles here. Actually, I'm going to pull up this picture. See how your iliacus runs right in here and then inserts onto the femur, and then your psoas major and minor, they're running in this direction as well, right? And they're attaching to the spine there. That's, again, pulling that anterior portion. But then, also part of your hip flexor complex, you are going to see right here, right? You're going to see that whole like sartorius muscle, and you're also going to see your rectus femoris, right? So as you look at it, like your quadriceps muscles, you've got your vasti muscles, which are just there to do knee extension, right? But then you've got your rectus femoris, which runs all the way up and also acts as a hip flexor. And what's our general rule about muscles, that have multiple actions? The more actions that a muscle has, the more likely it is to be overactive. That's why the lats is on so many big bad guy lists, right? It does internal rotation. It does shoulder extension. It does shoulder adduction. It does a little bit of spinal extension. It does a lot of stuff. Therefore, it is often one of our big bad guy muscles. So, rectus femoris is right on the front of the hips there, right? It's right on the front quadricep muscle there. So when you say SMR hip flexors, you are primarily talking about right there in the front, okay? But then we've also got a hip flexor. This is great because it's actually already up in this picture. Right here, that TFL, right? Remember, my TFL is an internal hip rotator, but it is also a little bit in charge of that hip flexion. So I'm going to put that on here separately because NASM's just saying hip flexor complex, right? They're talking about the psoas, they're talking about all of those. And it is really good. For the record, if you are also a massage therapist, or if you have like a manual therapy license and you are allowed to like do some manual therapy, you can go above the hip and get into those psoas and do like a psoas release, although your client's probably going to punch you in the face because that's also a really, really tight muscle that's very unpleasant. However, if you are not trained to do the psoas, do not goof around massaging your psoas. Your appendix is right there, and you do not want to poke your appendix and cause it to burst. So don't irritate that. Do not goof around with the psoas release unless you know how to do it. I know I'm exaggerating. I'm sure somebody out there is like, it's not that dangerous. And you're probably right, but it's better safe than sorry. So hip flexors. And then you are also going to SMR your TFL, okay? So part of that hip flexor complex. You can do this as release if you want, but I'm not putting it on this list. Hip flexors, TFL. We also want to foam roll the latissimus dorsi. So we'll say lats. And then, and I'm writing SMR here, I'm going to put the erector spinae. And that sometimes gets a little controversial because, again, do not foam roll your low back. I know I've said this before, but don't use a foam roller on your low back. You'll see people do it, and you know what? They never get hurt. They're fine. But, again, better safe than sorry. So what we got to do in our coaching tips here, we don't want to use a foam roller. So we will go over to our coaching tips, and we'll put a little asterisk, and we'll say, for erector spinae, use tennis ball and do not place on the spine, okay? So we do not foam roll hard tissue. We do not foam roll our spine, but you can take a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball and just set it barely off to the side. And you can work up that erector spinae. That's gonna be a really good way to kind of loosen that up. Questions about any of that? Comments about any of that? How are we feeling?
Good.
Okay. Next one we got to look at, let's get our static stretches. So we are going to do we'll start with the hip flexors. We'll start with the anterior hip flexors, so the rectus femoris and the psoas. So we're going to do a kneeling hip flexor stretch. Okay, that's going to be a good one to get in the front. Now, when you're doing this version, by the way, one of my favorite versions that is also not in your book, if you want to get primarily more into your rectus femoris, what you can do is you can actually elevate your foot. Because remember, the rectus femoris is also in charge of knee extension. So this is giving me a really weak little bit of hip flexor stretch, right? If I want to get a little more, I could always do this version where I drive my knee back. That'll go a little bit in there as well. Now, traditional kneeling hip flexor stretch is just right here, right? My foot kind of stays behind me. I squeeze my glute. I take my arm up and I lean forward, right? That's all well and good. But if I want to get a little bit deeper and I do a little bit more of an advanced version, I can elevate that rear foot slightly. And now I'm stretching it from the bottom and from the top. Now you'll notice instantly as I start to do this version, like my body is kind of going into a little tilt. So again, I have to posteriorly tilt, squeeze this glute, which drives my leg back into extension. And then I can take my arms up and I can lean forward, okay? That'll give me a little bit of a deeper kneeling hip flexor stretch. It's not in your books, but that's one of my all-time favorite stretches. So we'll go kneeling hip flexor stretch. We'll list out the kind of normal version. I forgot, we are in phase 1, so it's the static kneeling hip flexor stretch. We got to get the TFL, so we're going to do the static standing TFL stretch. Now on this one, in particular, if I'm dealing with like an external rotation client, I won't give them too much lean because a lot of clients, like, they'll kind of over lean. But if you got a client who's like, you know, again, they've got those tight psoas muscles, so when you raise your arms up overhead, you're pulling your spine, right? That takes that psoas into a stretch. I will put a little bit of special emphasis. I'll put less emphasis on the external rotation portion. I'll just have a little bit here, and I'll have them lunge a little further forward than they normally would. So I'm really focusing on like the hip extension. And see how my hips naturally wanted to open away? That is taking me back into like now this hip. Like if I turn this way, I'm not in hip extension anymore, right? Or I'm not in external rotation anymore. I'm just neutral, right? If anything, I'm internally rotated, right? So now I need to make sure I square my hips up like so. And then lunge forward, arm goes up, and then I'll really put special emphasis on leaning back towards the like 45 degrees, not straight back and not straight over, halfway between. And I'll reach, that'll give me a little bit of that psoas stretch as well. Just be cautious. If your client doesn't have balance to do that, make sure you're there to like help them or hold off until they get better core strength. So that's your standing TFL. We got to get the lats. Let's do a ball lat stretch. Right, that's the one where you have your hand on the stability ball as you stretch it away. And then let's get the static supine erector spinae stretch. So again, this is going to be, remember your spinae does a little bit of weak lateral trunk, a little bit of weak lateral rotation. There's no such thing as lateral rotation. A little bit of weak like rotation of the spine, right? So what you can do is, again, just go into that stretch where either you do the seated version where you cross over like this, or you could do the supine version where you actually just like lay down. I got the lay down version here because I'm a bigger fan of that one. So I do want to show you one bonus one today that is one of my all-time favorite stretches. We're going to do this one. At least I'm trying to make a mental note to remember to do this one when we get together in person. But I'm going to show you one of my favorite exercises, which is like a rotational erector spinae stretch. This is not static. This is actually going to be a dynamic stretch. And you guys can ask me questions once I do it here. But this is sort of our bonus for the day. So what you want to do, especially if you've got one of these AirX pads, you want to make sure that they line their pelvis up neutrally. So I actually like to use the AirX pad in between my knees, like so. And what that does is that kind of puts my pelvis, rather than my top one like falling into internal rotation, that kind of puts me in a more neutral position. So I'll kind of line that up right between the knees there. And then what you want to do is you want to have a 90-degree angle. So my spine is at a right angle with my upper thighs. Both hands are going to come together. By the way, I'm definitely going to run out of room when I do this exercise. So both palms are going to come together. And what you're going to do is you're just going to rotate and follow with your eyes that hand as it opens up neutrally across to the other side. Now, your primary goal here is to get your shoulder blades fully on the floor and have contact from fingertip to fingertip, like all the way from your body. So if you're having trouble keeping your knees together, feel free to open up your thigh, right? My priority is not to keep my pelvis and my knees together. My priority is to get full contact with my upper body. And then I'll just bring that right back through. So you'll go in this kind of 90-90 position. One of my favorite stretches. Even better than that, though, is the second version. Take your upper hand and rotate it, slide it along the floor. Once you get to about here, you're going to flip palm up and get to the same position and go back through that way. I cannot imagine how silly that looks on camera right now, but that's where you're going to look through. So you go from here and you actually slide your hand up, and then as it gets to the top, you flip palm up and then end, and you get into the same position there. That is a super, super awesome like rotator cuff activator and stabilizer, and you're moving through your whole erector spinae. That is one of my all-time favorite exercises. I do not know its official name. I have always called it a clock stretch because it's like the hands of a clock. That looks really sassy. I don't know. I always call it the clock stretch. I don't have an official name for it. But it is terrific. And we will do it once we get out in the real world. Hopefully again, hopefully on Thursday. Okay. And then so we got our kind of by the books version up here. So we foam rolled the hip flexors, the TFL, the lats, and the erector spinae. We did a kneeling hip flexor stretch, a standing TFL stretch, a ball lat stretch, and a supine erector spinae stretch. The only adjustment, yeah, it's fine. Actually, that works pretty well. So now a little bit of warm up here. Again, we have a problem with an anterior pelvic tilt, right? So we want to make sure we're not doing like stair climbing. Even an elliptical might be a little intense. Spin bike, right? Like if they're on a spin, they might be like pulling up with their toes. So let's go ahead and just put them on a classic like treadmill. One set, 5 minutes. Again, 40 to 50 or 40 to 60% heart rate max, depending on who the client is, right? One set of all this, duration, 30 seconds each. And there we go. That's a pretty good warm up. Now, we got to turn on our underactive stuff. So looking at our probable underactive muscles here, glutes, hamstrings, and core stabilizers, right? So really, really big ones here. Definitely when I get to my core exercise is going to be that floor bridge, right? Cannot stress that one enough, right? That is glute city. Doing that classic like hip raise. Floor bridge is going to be really big. That's a good core exercise. Let's go ahead and get another core exercise. We do see intrinsic core stabilizers here, so that plank is going to be absolutely phenomenal, right? So let's go with prone iso abs, because that's the official NASM name for the freaking plank. Then we got to get a balance exercise. I like the idea of the single leg balance reach. It was a good one, right? But at the same time, like this could be a little bit of like a lat stretch. So we might be able to get a little bit of lat stretching while stabilizing the spine if we go with like a single leg lift and chop. Ooh, we lost Raph. So that single leg lift and chop, right? Medicine ball in hand, standing with one leg here. Now, one thing to be aware of, guys, I really like single-sided exercises when somebody gets a chance to like fully bring their thigh up, and then they also get to like contract their foot into dorsiflexion, right? That activates like, you know, that's a great way to like turn those anterior tib muscles on. But if I've got a client with like overactive hip flexors, I do not want this thigh all the way up here. Get that thing just at the side right here, right? I want them doing their balance, but I do not want them into hip flexion. They're still going to pull their toe, but they're going to maybe have that ball all the way down here, and they're going to keep that thigh relatively low. So there's our single leg lift and chop, right? That'd be a really good one. My real favorite version of this, by the way, is also not in your book, but it's just like a cable lift. So actually, like, I will just have a client with like a very light cable, and then they'll just pull with one arm like this. Again, rotator cuff action, population U. So that's the single leg lift and chop. Then we need a reactive exercise. We did a squat jump to stabilization last time. Let's get a little bit of lateral action this time, right? Let's get a little side to side action just for the sake of variety. So we'll go with a lateral squat jump to stabilization, just because it's a little bit of, you know, variety. Any questions on why we chose what we chose with an anterior tilt? No? Cool. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this and make it our cool down. Oops. All right, and then let's go ahead and build. Let's talk about one more movement compensation today. Hey, stop lagging. Whoa! Oh my God. There we go. Oh, and I need to move treadmill up here. Okay. Formatting issues. All right, let's delete all this. And oh shoot, I forgot to put reps and stuff. Let's do 3 sets of everything. Let's go 20 reps for that, 30 seconds for that, 10 each for that, and 8 reps there. slow, isometric, slow, 3 to 5 second hold on land. 0 seconds rest. There we go. All right. Looking at a client, rather than the low back arch, let's look at an example, excessive forward lean, right? Now, this is gonna be another one of those weird problems. I mentioned it on Friday briefly, but if we look at the excessive forward lean, our overactive muscles, you're gonna see soleus and gastrocnemius, and then you're gonna see hip flexor complex and abdominal complex. So it's like our probable when somebody squats like this, right? That's their overhead squat. They do this big, super far forward lean, right? Again, if we're drawing that line from ankle to knee and we draw another line from hips up the upper body, those lines, rather than being parallel, are going to intersect, right? This is coming really far forward. So we're looking at like tight calf muscles or tight hip and ab muscles. Kind of weird, right? Those don't really correspond with each other. So this is another example of how, for a movement compensation, what we do is we got to figure out, is it the calf that's causing the forward lean or is it the hips? Are their hips literally just like when they squat, they're just trying to activate their abs and their abs are trying to do all their squatting, right? That is probably an example of like their low back is really weak and doesn't know how to stabilize their spine. So what's happening is the front of their ab, they're just so used to doing crunches, their abs are like this, and it's like trying to create stability, right? But it's not really designed to create stability. That's just pulling, right? That's movement rather than stability. Again, the big problem that most people have. So is it that's happening, or is it their ankle, which should be able to pull up like this, right? They should be able to do dorsiflexion. Is their ankle so bad at dorsiflexion that as their tibia travels forward due to a squat, it can't travel forward anymore, but they're trying to get lower and lower and lower. So what it can do is it can just take their weight forward, right? Like watch as I do a normal squat, watch my shin, watch the angle of my shin compared to the top of my foot. You'll notice like as I squat, my shins come forward, right? But if I try to do that, I'm gonna try and keep my shins 90 degrees. Notice how I start rocking backwards. So what I can do is I can lean forward like this. And now my shin doesn't have to change angle, right? That's gonna be a tight calf. So how do you figure out like, okay, well, so this is two problems in one. How do I figure out which is the real problem? Is it the hip flexors and the abs, or is it the calves? Well, you can take the ankle out of the equation. What you can do is you can use plates and press them, like lay them on the ground, and then have your client step onto those plates. Now they'll be up into like plantar flexion, and if they squat and their squat is like really good and they're like totally normal again, you know that the calf is the problem. But if they are up here and they still do that lean, you know that the hip flexors and the abs are the problem. So if it goes away after elevating the heels, it's the calves. If it doesn't go away after elevating the heels, it's the hips. One of my favorite methods, by the way, if you are somewhere in a gym that doesn't have like plates, I mean like near you, you know, like if you're on the sales floor and all the equipment's upstairs, first off, keep some plates downstairs. But if you don't, what you can do, one of my favorite methods is to have your client just take their shoes off, and then they can just step their heels onto their shoes. I'm showing you from the front, and this is a lateral view. So you can have your client step onto their shoes like so. And again, if they do the overhead squat and it's really good, you know that the calf is the problem. But if they still lean, then it's the hips and abs, okay? So we've already done a lot of calf stuff, and today we're talking about the hip stuff. So for the relevance of this, we are gonna say excessive forward lean tight hips and abs. Okay, so similar concept, right? If we look at our overactive muscles list, right? Hip flexor complex again, so rectus femoris, TFL. But then we're also gonna see the abdominal complex. We can't really do much like foam rolling on the abdominal complex. You've just got way too many sensitive, soft, squishy organs underneath. So we're not gonna do any massage for that or anything. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna go SMR, we're gonna go hip flexors, TFL, and we can leave it at that for now. For the record, there's a few more you can get, right? Like obviously I could work into my rectus femur. I could go further down into my quadriceps, into my rectus femoris that way. That might help a little bit. I can go down to the IT band. That might help a little bit. But for the most part, we'll just kind of leave that list a little bit shorter. But we can do our static kneeling hip flexor stretch. Static standing TFL stretch. Now, I know that my external obliques and my rectus abdominis are both overactive. So I need to get a good external oblique and rectus abdominis stretch. So your Cobra, NASM really recommends the Cobra stretch. And I like the Cobra stretch. I do. I'm not opposed to it. However, I actually think that Cobra is a little advanced for some beginner clients. So I'm going to put Cobra, by the way, as our example. But the difference between Cobra and another stretch called Sphinx pose is just a little bit of body positioning. And I think you can get a lot of really good rectus abdominis stretch with Sphinx pose. Hopefully you guys can see the whole thing. So Cobra is going to be here. You're going to go hands at your sides in a push-up position with your palms ever so slightly back. And then you're going to have the bottoms of your feet onto the floor. You're going to tighten your thighs, squeeze your glutes, and stretch straight up like this, okay? If you can't get your arms into a locked position, that's fine. But that's your Cobra stretch. I like it. I'm a fan. However, some clients, upper body strength, that can get a little tough. And some clients, that can put a lot of pressure on the low spine, especially if your client has like a condition like spinal stenosis. You got to be especially cautious with exercises like this, or if they have spondylosis or any of that kind of stuff. So you got to be kind of cautious with their discs during a Cobra stretch, because a lot of gravity is then coming down while it's all in this like, you know, closed position here. So one of my favorite ways to stretch your abdominals instead is Sphinx pose. Really similar. You're going to go down. You're going to go elbows onto the floor. And then you prop yourself up like this. Take your chest towards the floor. And then what you're going to do to get the stretch is you're going to press your palms down into the floor. And you're going to draw your elbows back towards your body. That driving back motion gives you a really good abdominal stretch. You can even hear it's a little hard for me to talk because my abdominals are being pulled into that stretched position, so I'm not able to like press as much. So that's another really good stretch. I really like Sphinx pose. Sphinx pose is not in your books though, so we're writing Cobra today. All right, so static Cobra stretch. Now we got to also get those obliques. Now I could always just do a simple lean here because my obliques are, you know, they assist in that lateral flexion, right? So I can always just do like a simple lean. And I actually really like this stretch, right? But again, I kind of got that in the TFL. So the other thing that my obliques do is that spinal rotation, right? So again, I'm going to do the static supine twist. Okay, that's static supine twist, which is that stretch that I didn't have room for, right? That classic. Now you can do this version here. You notice like this person has like one leg extended straight away. Both of those stretches are really good. Like This one tends to put a little bit less pressure on the spine. So I like to think of this as a very good like beginner stretch. But if your client can get into a full like, leg extended version in addition, that's going to put a little bit more stress there. And so this can be a little bit of a deeper stretch. But if you notice that your client cannot keep their shoulder blades on the floor while doing this version, you're going to want to regress that down to this version here. Okay. So static, supine, twist. And then treadmill again, right? They can absolutely put them on tread. This one, really, you can put them anywhere. Well, this is tight hips, so actually, I take that back. Treadmill is going to be a really good one. So one set of everything, 30 seconds each. And no coaching tips. All right. So now, if we look at our example, like, what exercise to work on, we're going to see just a pretty short list there. But our big underactive muscles, right? Hip flexors and abdominal complex. Our underactive muscles here, anterior tibialis, if it's the gastrocnemius and soleus. Again, remember, if they have the excessive forward lean on the calves, the ankle complex is the problem. The anterior tibialis is in charge of dorsiflexion, right? So if your client points their toe like crazy and they struggle with that dorsiflexion, you need to strengthen that anterior tip. So honestly, you're probably going to do a lot of like banded toe pulls and things like that. But in this case, we're looking at underactive glutes and underactive erector spinae, right? Remember, this person's being pulled downward. Their erector spinae is going to pull them into extension. This person's way too good at spinal flexion and not good enough at spinal extension. So our core exercise, we're going to do a prone, iso-prone cobra, right? That's going to be more commonly, very similar to the Superman, right? Superman is that one with the arms overhead where you pull both simultaneously. The difference with the cobra is that you're going to have your arms at your sides and you want to have your thumbs up. And so you contract like this. So it's going to be that type of spinal extension. So iso-prone cobra is going to be a really good one. We need an abdominal exercise. This person was very good at twisting. Now, their external obliques were overactive. Again, that's in charge of this. It does a little bit of this, and it does this, right? But your internal obliques are a good way to help you stabilize. And honestly, it's one of my favorite exercises to give to somebody who has an excessive forward lean, even though it's not on the list. Because they also can get a little bit of like, glute work in there as well. But particularly, we are going to see gluteus maximus is underactive here. So a floor bridge would probably be like our primary example of a strengthening exercise here. But since we've already got that in our other program, I'm going to put side iso abs. That's going to be a really good one. It does get a little bit of medial glute. It's not great for the glute max, but it's good for the glute med. And it is going to stabilize the spine. Then we can get a little bit of glute max work with like our little bit of glute max work when we get like our stability exercise. Again, this is going to be a really good one. We already have kind of given examples of like the single leg balance reach, right? And we've already done like the single leg lift and chop. Now, there are other really good stabilization like core exercises or balance exercises, right? Like there's single leg hip external rotation, but this is not one we're going to want to do because it activates that hip flexor so much. So we're kind of just going to go straight back to that single leg balance with reach. And we're going to go right into, oh, you know what? I just realized we got a really good one that we have not mentioned. I take it back. Single leg opposite arm, opposite leg raise. And I know that sounds very similar, but this is basically the total body bird dog here. So what you're going to do is you're going to have your client stand on one leg, this leg is going to kick back into hip extension. So I'm getting a little bit of glute work. I'm going to take my other arm, my contralateral arm up overhead, and I'm going to reach away at the same time. So as I go back here, I'm going to raise this opposite arm. And then I'm going to bring that back to neutral. Just like so. Okay? And that's sort of like a standing bird dog exercise. It's a great way to turn that glute on while also working a little bit on the upper body. I have not thought of that exercise in a while. I haven't used that as an example in quite some time. You should get that in here more often. And then we did the lateral jump. We did the normal jump. Let's do a box jump. Box jump to stabilization. 3 sets of everything. Let's do 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there, 10 each, 8, 3 to 5 second hold on land. Tempo is slow. Tempo is isometric. 0 seconds rest. 60 seconds rest at the end. All right, and then we will copy our warm up for our cool down. All right, and there we go. That is a very simple, very simple excessive forward lean. So tomorrow we will look at the upper body stuff. We're going to look at, in the overhead squat, arms fall forward, and then we will also look at shoulders elevate and forward head posture as well. So we'll build to tomorrow. Do you guys have any questions about that? About the programs we built? Did I move too quick? Everybody good on that?
Yeah, that was good.
All right, guys. Well, that is that's about all I got for you today. We will get this handout up. So it'll have a handout. You'll have your notes, and then you'll just see the PowerPoint today. Other than that, no homework except for from Friday. Our final is coming up this Friday. We've got our last piece of homework tomorrow. Then we'll have another day, and then we'll have the final. So obviously, again, it's all up on Canvas. Practice those homeworks as much as you can. The more you practice them, the better you'll do on the final. As you guys can see, there's not very much content left in the PowerPoint, but there's a lot of questions about posture. So that's kind of the questions you want to start expecting in the next homework and in your final exam, because it's going to be from homeworks 3 and homeworks 4 for the final. It's going to be a lot of questions about, like, your client has an excessive forward lean. Which of the following stretches is most appropriate? Your client has a forward head posture. Which of the following muscles is likely underactive? So, like, variations of that, either like overactive, underactive, or what exercises are most appropriate, right? Like a bridge is really great for strengthening the glutes. The glutes are underactive, right? At the end of the day, it's all the same question. It's just they reword it a million different ways. So do you guys have any questions about that?
Nope.
As soon as I mentioned testing, I'm sure somebody's like, I got questions. All right, nope, all right. Well, then I will not drag this out any further, and I will release you all from the grasp of Zoom. The grasp of Zoom, which was the name of my Dungeons and Dragons groupies in high school. So that's about it today. I will see you guys tomorrow.